Okay, thank you. So we've had a most interesting discussion about regulation. Regulation is, of course, extremely important in the context of the current crisis. And one of the points I'd just like to add in relation to regulation, that the failure of Irish regulation didn't, of course, just create disaster for the Irish economy, it's also created a disaster for other economies, in particular the German economy, because of the location of DEPFA Bank in the IFSC, which is taken over by Hypobank and required a bailout by the German taxpayer of 102 billion. DEPFA Bank, Hypobank has just been nationalised. So there are at least 4 other banks in the IFSC that also have created huge problems for the German banking system. So to talk to to address the subject that I'm going to talk today about, one of the features of the current crisis is that most alternative banking systems, both in Ireland and other countries, have suffered lowered losses and required less state aid than publicly quoted financial institutions. Yet, in the debate on possible solutions to the banking crisis in Ireland and indeed in other countries, alternative banking systems are rarely discussed. And this has been a general feature. So what do we mean by alternative banking systems? Well, alternative banking systems largely relate to credit unions and mutually owned societies. Now, the first point I want to say is that NAMA will work in some of its stated objectives, and that is to stabilise the banking system. The NAMA process could be also improved by reducing uncertainty of its outcomes as far as possible and reducing risk to the state. My own belief is that the main debated alternative, NAMA versus nationalisation, NAMA was probably less risky to the state than nationalisation. The third alternative, which I had advocated earlier on, and Fine Gael to some extent advocated, that was that you let the banks, you keep them going, you let maybe Anglo-Irish fold or whatever, and you set up an alternative banking system. I advocated a state-owned bank, and Fine Gael had a development bank. But that proposal never really got off the ground. The reason I think NAMA won't work in all its objectives is because it's irrational for banks to lend in the current crisis. Why would they lend to individuals or firms that are just about to lose further money? And this is a feature not just of the Irish economy, but of the Eurozone economy generally. That table shows the annual increase in lending from May 08 to August 09 in Eurozone loans. So you see that May 08, total increase is 10.5, August 09, 0.1. There's actually in households, there's actually from April to August, there's been approximately 0. So this is despite all the bailouts, all the mergers, all the acquisitions, all the activity that's gone into the Eurozone economy. There's been very little growth in lending. In Ireland, it's exactly the same. In fact, credit conditions have tightened since then. So this is an area that it's particularly serious, so I should say, that this for small and medium-sized enterprises, because bank lending is the main source of funds to small and medium-sized enterprises. Larger companies can tap the bond market. And in fact, you may have read or may not have read that the bond markets have been extremely active in this 8 months of this year. More bonds have been raised, about twice were raised in the entire year 2008. So large firms can go off and get bonds. And in fact, it can become a little bit like Japan. The large multinational companies have lots of assets, lots of financial assets, lots of cash, and the banks may be a bit short of cash and they have difficulty. So this is an area, I think, where alternative banking models may be in a better position to provide credit to the benefit of local economies. Mutually owned societies and credit unions could be very important. Why is this? Alternative banking models suffer fewer agency-type problems. Agency-type problems are really severe in banking and in other systems. What do we mean by agency-type problems? We mean problems between the principal between one individual and another because of gaps of information, because of incentive-type effects between shareholders and managers and companies, conflicts of interest between depositors and borrowers, conflicts of interest in other areas. There are lots of agency-type problems, including moral hazard, somebody revealing or not revealing information. There can be incentive effects. One of the problems that's been alluded to in the regulation, and the problems of regulation, were the incentive effects for certain managers in large financial companies to artificially create profits. So they created profits in the short run, but in the long run, it wasn't profit at all. It was just a return for the extra risk that they were undertaking. So in the case of a mutual or a credit union, Remuneration cannot be by stock options. That gets rid of one source of risk and regulatory problems. Stock market quotation can put excessive emphasis on short-term results compared with the long run. However, we also have to recognise that not-for-profits such as mutuals also suffer problems. There are governance issues. One share, one deposit means there's a relatively low participation rate by shareholders depositors. And incumbent management can stay entrenched without any accountability. So the table I want to show you is, in the next table, is just a ranking by governance of the 6 main covered institutions. So the ranking is just a little survey I did, and you not obviously, not surprised that Anglo-Irish Bank becomes out worse in terms of corporate governance, and the Educational Building Society comes out best. We also know there's another building society, the Irish Nationwide, that also comes out as being extremely poor in corporate governance. And the transference of loans to NAMA approximately reflects the degree of corporate governance. The worse the corporate governance, the more loans have to be transferred to NAMA. So we can see, look, there are problems with building societies, and some of you may remember the Irish Permanent and the problems with the Irish Permanent. It's not obvious that a mutually owned society, as a building society, is necessarily behave in a desirable way and meeting the objectives of society or whatever. So in conclusion, mutuals and credit unions have in general suffered lower losses than for the profit sector, the for-profit sector in the current crisis. Now, some might say this is because of the regulator, Brendan Lowe, but it's not just that. It's because of the institutional structure. It's because of the incentives within credit unions. It's because they're locally based. Alternative banking models, because they're locally based, may suffer fewer information asymmetries. They're more integrated with the local economy. It may be easier for them to lend to local firms. They lend not on the basis of the actual business plan or the product. They may lend on the basis of knowing people, knowing their family, knowing the background to the firm, and knowing a lot more softer information, which can be very, very useful in the case of lending and other relationships. It may also indicate that credit unions have scope for further increasing their operations by acting as a conduit for guarantee loan type schemes. That's one of the things I've advocated in the current crisis, that the small, medium-sized enterprises should be facilitated, they should be helped in the current crisis by a guaranteed loan type scheme. That is, that the state would underwrite a certain proportion of the loan in the event of default. Credit unions, because they're locally based, may be in a particularly useful position to do this. But the main problem is, and this raises the issue of whether credit unions have the necessary skills to access loans and to assess loans and how these skills might be acquired. It's also maybe the case that the mutuals, the building societies, don't have the skill set to be able to behave like proper banks. And I think that's a major challenge for the credit unions if they're to have a greater role in the economy, greater role in helping local communities and other areas. They have to upgrade their skill set. How can this be done? That's an issue that has to be addressed. Thanks very much.